Thank you for taking my call. Before we continue, could you say the first and third digits of your security pin? Oh, I didn't catch that. Sorry. That's the second and fourth, please. Okay, lovely. All gone through. Did you see what I did there?
It's a scam. Never reveal your full security PIN, even if you think it's your bank calling. Learn how to protect yourself from fraud.
This is a Global Original podcast.
It must have been the worst general reporter the Daily Express has ever hired. When I started out in journalism, my aim was a Bolshevik one. I wanted to put forward the revolutionary socialist beliefs that I held. That's how it began. It's a form of trying to pretend that the consequences of revolution are not inevitably a sea of blood and millions of dead. And that's what we tried to pretend. We didn't want to kill millions of people, though I think we were probably, in our hearts, willing to kill people for the cause. You were close to your brother, whether you want to be or not. I was close to him when we were having the public row, and I was close to him when we used to fight as children, and I was close to him when he was dying. It is tedious trying to debate with people who don't know how to argue, who don't know how to rebut, who are not interested in opposing cases.
Hello and welcome to How I Got There with me, Matt Stadlen, where we hear what it takes really to succeed from those who already have. From the mouths of some of our most compelling public figures, we discover how upbringing, perseverance, luck, and yes, failure have shaped their lives. My guest this week is Peter Hitchens. For those who don't know, before becoming one of Britain's most well-known columnists, Peter was a political journalist. He was a foreign correspondent as well in Washington and Moscow, and he reported on the collapse of the Easterm Bloc. He wrote for the Daily Express for a couple of decades before changing to the Mail on Sunday at the turn of the millennium. He's a Christian, and his books include The Rage Against God and The Abolition of Britain. Well, you're never afraid to give voice to your views, Peter, whether on telly, radio, or these days online. And you've condemned the use of the word Islamophobia. You've argued against the legalisation of cannabis and other drugs, and you've called for the destruction of the Conservative Party. Hardly uncontroversial. Oh, and of course, the late, many would argue, great Christopher Hitchens was your older brother. A very warm welcome. So, Peter, this is all about how you got there. You were born in Malta, because I think your father's naval career required you to move around quite a bit, not just in Britain, but in its dependencies.
Well, that was his last foreign posting.
Your father was deployed during the war on HMS Jamaica, which took part in
HMS Jamaica.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. When I was growing up, no one in the Navy ever referred to being on a ship. they would expostulate and say, "You don't live on a house, do you? Well, you don't live on a ship either. You live in it."
I'm very happy to be.
Forgive me. It's just one of those things. It jolts me whenever I hear anybody say on a ship.
While in HMS Jamaica,
in HMS Jamaica,
he took part in, or the ship took part in the sinking of a German warship in 1943.
Boxing Day 1943, yes, Battle of the North Cape.
Your brother, I believe, Christopher, at some stage said that day's work was a better or greater day's work than he had ever accomplished in his life. Your mother was a Wren. How did these experiences of your parents shape you as a boy?
Oh, good heavens, the Navy was so present. My first memories are of Rosyth, the great Edwardian naval base, where we were living when I first swam into consciousness. Great grey ships, cranes, naval uniforms, naval terminology. The Navy was the background of my life, and very present again in both Portsmouth and Plymouth. A lot of my fellow school boys at the school, which I probably attended more consistently than any other of the many schools I've been to, were the sons of naval officers. It had a huge impact on me. I wanted very much to be a destroyer captain.
But a problem with an eye prevented it?
I have a lazy left eye, which wasn't discovered till quite late and was uncorrectable by then, which simply ruled me out.
What sort of impact did not being able to fulfil that particular ambition have on you?
Cheesed off. I discovered about the eye when I must have been, I think it was the year that Yuri Gagarin went into space. I was coming out of the optician, hearing the news, and there were billboards flapping about Gagarin's orbit. So I was 11, perhaps 10, 11, I can't remember. It was plain there was nothing to be done about it, and what can't be cured must be endured. So I reckoned, OK, well, not that. And since then, I've realised it was a jolly good thing, because the poor old Navy, even as I was discovering this, being torn to pieces and reduced to a shadow.
I'm trying to visualise Peter Hitchens as a naval officer. What sort of a naval officer do you think you would have made?
Terrible, I would imagine, but who knows? I mean, I might have been good at it.
Did your parents encourage you to believe that you could do anything that you wanted, be anything you wanted to?
Do you know what? I don't think we ever really discussed it. I have to boast here, I was quite bright. I was usually near the top of any class I was in. I could always write. I read a lot.
So what sort of a childhood was it?
Oh, fantastically, wonderfully neglected. During the school holidays, we practically ran wild. There would be days when we'd just be given half a crown and go off on bicycles or on foot and just roam around. It really was like that.
I'd been thinking of tea times where a young Christopher and a young Peter were sitting around the table talking politics. But
No.
Politics
didn't really enter into our family life probably until Christopher was at public school. The Christmas of 1964, he came home and had developed a really strong interest in politics.
Did that rub off on you?
Oh, yes. One of the things that certainly happened to me, that children growing up in the small confines of the suburbs pretty quickly develop a desire to get out and about and go out into the world. An interest in politics is one way of doing that. First of all, it lifts your imagination out of the boring concerns of suburban life, and secondly, it gives you a grandiose objective, which makes you feel more important, and thirdly, it aids you in a career choice and generally makes you more interested in the world.
Did you measure your success against your brothers?
Other people do. It had never crossed my mind until they started doing so, that there was any sort of contest. It really hadn't.
Who do you think, if there is a contest, who do you think won that contest?
Oh, I think we both won it. I think here we are, we're the suburban sons of an obscure naval officer coming out of nowhere in particular. Both of us have made names in the great world which a lot of people would find enviable. My only regret is that neither of our parents were around to see it.
Well, how did it happen?
I don't know. It did, but how?
Do you feel that your successful lives ran in parallel, or do you think in any way they fed off each other?
Of course they fed off each other to some extent. Someone would have to write some sort of biography to find out just exactly how much each fed off the other and which came first and which came second and who was responding to one or the other. But of course they did.
You fell out with your brother, I believe, Peter, in 2001, after something that you wrote in The Spectator.
No, he fell out with me. I didn't fall out with him.
How was reconciliation achieved?
I would have reconciled immediately. I wrote an article about something that he'd written on September the 11th, and I sent him a copy of it in advance because it was plainly critical of him, and I thought he ought to see it. And his response to me was, I hate to revive this now because he's not here to answer, but his response to it was to write back and say that I was lying, which I was not. I felt that under the circumstances I would go ahead and publish it. He then very publicly denounced me in various American publications and wouldn't speak to me. He chose to fall out. He liked rows. He once even managed to have a row. This is incredible to me. He had a row with James Fenton, a wonderful, entirely delightful person, almost impossible to dislike or fall out with. And Krista managed to have a falling out with James.
How did you make friends?
I think friendship ever really... He wrote a piece in Vanity Fair after he'd been written to by some of his readers, criticising him for continuing to be hostile to me, and he offered the hand of reconciliation, and I cheerfully took it.
He's quoted as having said there is no longer any official froideur, but there's no official, what's the word, chaleur either.
Yeah, he did love doing those French things.
Did you become quite close, though, by the end? Because you had to watch your brother very publicly, and I'm sure privately as well, die.
I think there was... You are close, it seems to me. I mean, I've only had one brother once, but you were close to your brother whether you want to be or not. I was close to him when we were having the public row, and I was close to him when we used to fight as children, and I was close to him when he was dying.
How did his death affect you?
Well, I wrote about it, and I don't really want to repeat very much what I wrote. It was a moment of loss and loneliness, as the death of someone who's been that close to you always is, and it persists. And there is nobody else alive now with whom I share certain memories. Nobody. I don't know whether this has happened to you, but if it has, you'll know what I mean.
No, not yet.
If it hasn't, then I hope it stays away from you for a long time.
Do you have regrets about your relationship with him?
Oh, inevitably, yes. And any properly lived life is a mass of regret.
What would you change?
I have no idea now. I don't have any great belief in being able to change the past. It's the problem with the past. It's gone.
There was no sense in which you were living in the shadow of your brother, or that you wanted to somehow outdo him from an early age?
We used to fight.
Physically?
And for a long time, oh yes, and for a long time, because I was 2.5 years younger than him, and therefore, until I was about 13 or 14, quite a lot smaller than him, I would lose. And then I got a bit bigger and I began not to lose. It didn't happen so often after that.
And you're quite a burly figure. Does your pugnacious...
I'm quite fat. I wasn't then.
You're being unkind on yourself.
No, I am quite fat, but it's not. But I tend to think that 66, that's one of those penalties you have to pay. But I certainly wasn't then. No, I was quite slight.
You do come across as a rather pugnacious physical figure. Do you think that has any relationship whatsoever with your pugnacious intellectual style?
No, I'm a physical coward, beyond all doubt.
Did you have girlfriends growing up?
No, it's a very odd thing which happened to me a couple of years ago, which now makes me smile, but I had a pretty low opinion of my pulling power as a teenager. And I was sometimes puzzled by the sometimes quite enthusiastic responses I got. I wrote a review of a book by Linda Grant called Upstairs at the Party, and in the course of that, one of the picture researchers at the Mail on Sunday said, "Are there any pictures of you in your student era?" And I said, "No, as far as I know, none." And she said, "That's a challenge." And she came back about 3 weeks later with an expression of complete glee on her face, and she'd found this picture of me looking like a sort of cut-rate Bob Dylan. And I thought, if I'd known in 1969 that I looked like that, it would have been awful. I would have behaved so much worse.
Did you behave badly?
Not that badly, quite badly on some occasions, but not as badly as I would have behaved if I'd realised that that's how I looked to other people. No.
Now, your early career as a journalist.
I treasure that photograph. I've had copies made.
And so instead of having regrets, you count your blessings. Fundamental to how you got there was your own political transformation. How often do you change your mind on something?
Well, I have rather notably changed my mind on almost all the most significant matters in life, the universe and everything.
But within your current worldview...
It could happen again.
Could it?
Well, by its nature, I've established that I'm capable of doing it, which most people, it seems to me, are not. So it would be idle to pretend that I wasn't capable of doing it, or that it might not happen again. I don't feel it coming on at the moment very much, though.
You have said, correct me if I'm wrong, that it was a reasonable mistake to have made being a socialist. You said it taught you how to think in a lot of ways. So you didn't regret the experience at all, and you think everybody should have it. Why did you change from socialism to social conservatism?
Well, it's so dull, isn't it? I did what everybody in every century of human experience has done. As I grew older, I stopped being a utopian and became a conservative. Everybody did it until about 1960. After that, practically nobody did it. It was a reasonable mistake to make because people at a certain age who are at all observant know that there is something gravely wrong with the world, that there is no justice in it to begin with, and they want to do something about it. That I chose the wrong solution is obviously partly my fault, but also partly because it's a solution which is repeatedly presented to people in various forms. I thought it was a good one, and I followed it and found in detail that it wasn't a good solution, that it was, in fact, not a solution at all, but a danger, and I gave it up.
But you were a member of the International Socialists from, I think, 1969, when you were
68,
just... 68. You were just about 17 then?
Yeah.
And you continued there until roughly 1975.
I resigned in 1975. I didn't drift away or fail to renew my membership. I actually wrote a letter of resignation, which I used to hope MI5 had kept, but I think MI5 was destroyed its file on me, so I can't get hold of it. I didn't keep a copy.
How do you know whether MI5 either kept a file on you or got rid of the file?
I tried very hard to get hold of my MI5 file after David Blunkett announced that it would be possible for that to happen, and I refused it. And I came to the conclusion, after studying various moments in parliamentary debates, that the new Labour government had almost certainly had most of the records of what MI5 used to call subversives destroyed. You'll have to guess why they might have wanted to do that, but given that there were quite a few Bolsheviks in the new Labour government, it's possible that might have been on their minds at the time. I don't think those records exist anymore. There couldn't have been any disadvantage in handing it over if they'd blacked out the names of a few people. I mean, I had a pretty good idea who the security service people were who were in our organisation looking at us, so that wouldn't have been a surprise to me, but I would just have liked to see what they said about me at the time. Nothing would have been exposed, no damage would have been done to national security. I think they wouldn't give it to me because they haven't got it anymore.
What sort of a risk to the state did you represent?
Very small in myself, though our organisation attracted on its fringes people who might have been dangerous, and that was probably one of the reasons why the security service was interested in us. I remember once being physically assaulted by someone I'm pretty convinced was an IRA member in a pub in York when I put forward the classic Trotskyist position on terrorism and told him that I didn't sympathise with Irish terrorism. And he got very angry. So we were dangerous in that we spread those ideas, particularly among students, people who would become later influential in public life. And we were dangerous in that many of us who went through that experience never fully got over it and continued to believe revolutionary things as they went off into the BBC and the legal profession and into politics, where they all now are.
But in 2010, I think you dismissed the cruel revolutionary rubbish, in your words, that you'd promoted as a member of the International Socialists. You'd promoted it as a poison.
Yes, that's more or less true. I regret it, but then, of course, I regret a lot of things that I did that also gained me invaluable, irreplaceable experience which I couldn't have gotten any other way.
But of course, by the time you were a Trotskyist in the late 60s and early 70s, it had become abundantly clear the wickedness of communism. So was it really so reasonable?
Well, this is the point about Trotskyism. Trotskyism is communism which denies responsibility for the faults of communism. What we believed was, and particularly my version of it, which classified the Soviet Union as state capitalist and not socialist at all, was that the revolution had been betrayed by Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and that the outcome, the Gulag and the KGB and all the rest of it, was not an essential or necessary outcome of revolutionary socialism. Indeed, one of our great saints and heroines, Rosa Luxemburg, had specifically warned against this tendency in Bolshevism. So we tended to think that if we got a hold of the levers of power, we wouldn't be like that. The delusion was to think that. The fact is, it's a form of trying to pretend that the consequences of revolution are not inevitably a sea of blood and millions of dead. And that's what we tried to pretend. We didn't want to kill millions of people, though I think we were probably, in our hearts, willing to kill people for the cause.
Were you really prepared to kill in the name of the cause?
I think if the opportunity had arisen, and the circumstances were a long way off, well, all we were doing was trying to recruit dockers and mine workers, and in my case, people building coaches in Scarborough. But if it had come, I think so. This was a very strong passion.
This isn't just you looking back as a social conservative.
Well, it might be. Memory is a lying jade. I can't produce any certificates. But on the other hand, I think that this was a very strong passion, stronger than any religious feelings I now have, for instance, as strong as the sort of patriotism I once felt as a child, and very powerful. And that, of course, is another feeling which leads people to violence in a cause which they believe to be so good that nothing can be allowed to get in the way of it.
So what would this cause have led to? Had you taken over Britain, what would Britain have looked like?
I have no idea. That was the trouble. I always have had some difficulty in formulating manifestos when I'm an awfully long way from being in a position to implement them. It seems to me to be silly. We talked loosely of a workers' state, and we certainly wouldn't have had anything to do with the existing parliamentary system. And I'm sure we would have dispensed with the Bill of Rights and Magna Carta and habeas corpus and all the other things that the current government is so busy dispensing with too, but in a more delicate and tasteful way. If you believe that you're right about something, and if you believe that you can create a wholly new society, that you can, in Tom Paine's words, begin the world over again, then there's almost nothing you're not prepared to overthrow and sweep away in the belief that what you put there instead will be better. That's the mistake you make. But as I say, it's a reasonable mistake to make if you're in your late teens and the world looks corrupt, and we're just at that stage getting over the Vietnam War, and the people in power have discredited themselves on both sides of the Iron Curtain, and patriotism has gone. The Profumo affair and the Suez catastrophe have wiped out the credit of your own country's governing class. It's not unreasonable to feel that way if you're a politically interested, idealistic person in your teens, and that's how I felt.
You say that you didn't drift away from being a Trotskyist, from being a socialist.
I specifically resigned.
You specifically resigned. What was the Eureka moment? Can you remember it? How did it dawn on you that this was not the way forward?
Well, there is no, as in all these things, there is no Eureka moment. It's a process of accumulating evidence and thought.
But you didn't drift?
No, I didn't drift. But on the other hand, I didn't also suddenly have... People always want a blinding flash or a swoon. It's not like that. You know that there is a door, and that beyond that door are unwelcome conclusions, and you hesitate to open it. You know that when you open it, you will lose a lot of friends, that your life as it has been will certainly become less pleasant and more lonely, and you hesitate to do it, and you keep in the back of your mind things which ought to be in the front of it, and then eventually there's just too much to go on, and you say, that's it, I've got to go, I can't carry on with this.
How quickly, then, did you morph into a social conservative?
You make a great distinction between socialism and social conservatism. Actually, you're wrong to do so. A lot of socialism is highly conservative. The British Labour Party, while socialist, was extremely socially conservative for a lot of its history. And until the era of Harold Wilson, when, as it were, the Oxbridge intellectuals took over the Labour Party, that was very much a part of socialism. There's no particular contradiction. And there was a lot of social conservatism, not enough, in my view, in the Soviet system as well.
What was your lucky break, Peter, as a journalist? Was there one? How did you become a national journalist?
Breaks, but you have to ask specific questions here.
Well, how did you become a national journalist?
When I started out in journalism proper, my aim was a Bolshevik one. I wanted to rise in my career of journalism so that I could use my position in newspapers to put forward the revolutionary socialist beliefs that I held. That's how it began. I went and did the necessary apprenticeship on provincial newspapers. I did 2.5 years, it must have been, on the Swindon Evening Advertiser, learning law, shorthand, and everything from flower shows to golden weddings to court cases.
Which in those days as a journalist was almost indispensable.
It was. If you spoke Chinese or had a double first in economics, you could sometimes bypass it. And what I spent an awful lot of time doing while I was doing all that, because of the Trotskyist thing, I was very gripped with the fascinating front line, I still think, of British journalism and bitterly fought industrial disputes of the late 70s and early 1980s, which absorbed my life for several years, and particularly really wanted to work for the Labour desk of the Financial Times. And I must have applied 15 times for jobs. I got 2 interviews and very nearly got a job on the FT. And thank heaven, from their point of view and mine, that I never did. I moved from the Swindon Advertiser to the Coventry Telegraph, where I was actually officially an industrial reporter. And I was in the middle of the most terrible controversy with one of the senior executives there when my father-in-law, as he was to become, he was my girlfriend's father at the time, he said that the Express got a new editor and news editor and was hiring, and he reckoned that if I applied then, I had a good chance of getting a job. It suited me very well because the crisis I was in at the Coventry Telegraph was quite deep. And so I wrote in, and they asked me out for an interview. And they gave me a job as a general reporter. I must have been, I think, the worst general reporter the Daily Express has ever hired. It's not what I was ever any particularly good. I wanted to be a specialist. I didn't want to be a general reporter. But I survived a few months of it and then became, first of all, an education reporter and then an industrial reporter. So I was doing what I wanted to do.
So you'd done well enough then, eventually, to graduate to becoming a reporter on the collapse of the Easterm Bloc?
Well, that I do, to some extent, say is down to initiative and desire. When I was an industrial reporter in the late summer of 1980, it became clear that there was this huge convulsion going on in Poland. The great solidarity strikes in the Lenin shipyards in Gdansk. And the TUC Congress had a terrible controversy over this because they were very reluctant to give it its full support, even though it was a foreign strike and it was against very oppressive conditions and a very oppressive regime, because the British Labour movement at the time was more close than it would now care to admit to communism and to sympathy for the Soviet Union. And I went to the then editor of the Daily Express, a very nice and very thoughtful man called Arthur Firth, and I said, I think the most important industrial story going on in the world now is in Gdansk. And he said, OK, we'll get yourself a visa and go. And I did, and it was an extraordinarily exhilarating experience. I took the train all the way to Warsaw, and then enormous stroke of luck, Lech Wałęsa was there in the Hotel Morskie in Gdansk, and there was a student there who spoke English who interpreted for me, and I was able to get an interview with him in which he denounced the TUC for being what they were. So it made me a story and a feature. I got in the paper, and at that point, I'd tasted blood. I really wanted to be both a foreign reporter, and I really, really wanted to write about the Eastern Bloc.
How did you make that transition from writing about the news as a reporter to commenting on it as a commentator? I
owe this really to Nick Lloyd, who was the editor of the Daily Express, who sent me to Moscow, and thought quite correctly that the best way of communicating what was going on was not in news stories, which ultimately just turned everything into some briquettes, but by writing a column about what it was like to be there. One week I'd go down to the extraordinary place south of Moscow where they keep all the steam locomotives, which would be the only means of transport that would work after a nuclear war, or I would write about going to a Soviet beer bar where you fed a 5-kopeck coin into a slot and it's urinated out half a litre of thin, disgusting lager that tasted of trams. That kind of thing was much more interesting to most people and told them much more about what the Soviet Union was like than a report on the Congress of People's Deputies. And that was Nick's idea, and I did that. And from that, I began to develop a sort of relationship with readers who began to write to me about it, and a sort of appreciation of what people did appreciate. I'd never really known what it was about what I wrote that people liked. If ever I've tried to write for effect, I've failed. But I did find that in describing these things, I began to develop a relationship with the readers. And then soon after I got back from the USA, where I attempted the same thing but wasn't quite so successful at it, I was offered a column of my own to write on British national affairs, and that's how that began. But I think it was without the Moscow experience, it would never have happened.
So there's a sense in which this all began through your own initiative. You asked to go to Poland. From that, eventually, you ended up in Moscow. You were in Washington as well, but as you say, perhaps not for such a long time. In Russia, you started to become a columnist, essentially.
Yes, I think that's more or less fair, yes.
But witnessing these great events in 20th century history, was that a really important part of the path to becoming a columnist eventually? Having got your hands dirty in world politics?
Well, I don't think anyone can really be a columnist unless they've had some experience of some kind that other people haven't had. It doesn't have to be that one, but I would say that living in the Eastern Bloc in the final days of communism, that living in Moscow during the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that some of the other things that I've done, from witnessing executions in the United States to running into a certain amount of trouble in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, are useful in being able to write about everything in a way that other people possibly might not.
Is that because it gives you a gravitas, or because it really helps you to understand the world better?
I think you understand the world, you understand yourself, you, I think, perhaps are better able to communicate it. But I'm not offering a scientific explanation. I just think it's true. And other people might become columnists through completely different sorts of experience. For me, I think if somebody said, why on earth should I bother to read what you write? What entitles you to pontificate in this fashion? That's really all I can call on.
Tell us about the trouble you ran into in the Congo.
There's an awful lot of 1930s mines in Congo where there's metal, which has now become incredibly valuable, but the conditions in which the people work to get it out of the ground are pretty appalling. And we've gone out of Lubumbashi. This is in what used to be Katanga, which, if you're my age, is quite a redolent name. We found one of these places, a great pit in the ground, like the first or second circle of hell, of people slaving away. And they realized, I think, that foreign media coverage of what was going on there might lead to it being closed down. And so the gangmasters who were running it got the crowd worked up against us, and they surrounded the car we were in. I thought we'd had it, but by great good fortune we hadn't, so we got out.
Now, I asked the Times and Spectator columnist Matthew Parris, who you may or may not know personally,
I do.
Whether he felt a responsibility about putting his views and ideas out into the public domain. And this is what he said, Peter. He said, "No, absolutely none. I just toss something into the debate, into the arena. I don't always know if it's right. I hope it is. I just like to see what effect it has. I throw a stone into the pond and watch the ripples. I don't agonise." How closely do you identify with that?
Not at all. I completely disagree. I think he's quite wrong. I also think it's a mistake in responsibility what Matthew writes has an effect on an awful lot of people. Maybe he's being ultra-modest, or maybe he's bluffing, but I find it hard to believe he really thinks that. A lot of people, particularly on Saturday morning in the Times, turn to what he writes to help them form their own opinions about major developments. And he has a responsibility whether he likes it or not, and he influences them. And I think that you have to be aware of that. There's this old warning that if you write where many read or speak where many listen, you have heavy responsibilities as to what you say.
And do you feel that responsibility as a Mail on Sunday columnist?
Yes, I do. I think it is a responsibility. It's a huge privilege, which I wake up each morning valuing, but it's also a responsibility. The two things always go together, it seems to me. From those to whom much is given, much is required, and that's it.
I also asked Matthew whether he ever tries to be controversial, so being deliberately controversial. He said, yes, a columnist needs to be clear and bold and diverting in what he writes, and I try to be even when my thoughts might be rather more nuanced. What's your take on that?
Well, I hope I don't do that. I hope I would never express an opinion more strongly than I felt it.
Have you done?
God is the only judge who knows your inmost heart. Who would be able to answer that for certain? I would say not.
Which takes us in a moment to religion. But first, what sort of a pressure do you feel every single week having to come out with something distinctive in the paper?
The moment last week's column is over, you begin to consider the next one. So far, so good.
Do you ever have writer's block?
No, I don't think newspaper journalists can afford to have writer's block, can they?
Do you feel pressure? Is it ever stressful?
It's pressure. I mean,
is it stressful?
There's always a fear of failure in any important endeavour you undertake.
But part of success, of course, is sustaining success. Is there a sense in which you ever feel that you're fighting for survival, that next week's column could be your last? Now, I don't mean this in a way to attack you at all. This is how I feel sometimes as a journalist myself. There's a lot of insecurity that comes with the profession. I mean, you have a very privileged slot.
Well, I do have, yes, I do, yes. Well, I aim to keep it if I possibly can, but it would be pointless going out fretting all the time that it might be taken away from me. If it's going to be taken away from me, then that will happen. Ultimately, one is judged by two forces, the readers and the editor of the paper you work for.
You're not shy, of course, of an opinion. Anthony Howard wrote of you, I think in 2009, saying the old revolutionary socialist has lost nothing of his passion and indignation as the years have passed us all by. It is merely the convictions that have changed, not the fervour and fanaticism with which they continue to be held. How do you cope with being a public figure? You put your views out there, and it's not just like being a celebrity, but you are there as someone who is saying, this is what I believe, and therefore you are open to huge numbers of people criticising you who feel diametrically sometimes opposite. Do you relish that?
Well, I'm also open to huge numbers of people who agree with me.
Has criticism ever stung? You must have developed, if you didn't have already, a pretty thick skin.
My criticism stings when it's true. I mean, if you haven't done your homework properly, if you make a fool of yourself in debate by breaking the rules that you yourself keep to, if you get your facts wrong, that hurts. Yes, of course it does. And then you go away and try very hard not to do it again.
So how do you deal with those who disagree?
Well,
does it ever get to you?
Disagree. I mean, if it's possible, if they don't have opposing interests to mine, I would try to change their minds. I don't mistake Twitter for the world. Or the world for Twitter.
So what was it like being booed on Question Time when you said, I think, that the expansion of sex education had been followed by increased numbers of teenage pregnancies and sexually transmitted diseases?
Oh, it was quite boring to be booed because what I'd said was incontrovertibly the case. It has been, and I was careful to say it had been followed by it. I wasn't offering it as a causal explanation. But even that, they weren't prepared to discuss.
One of the things I'm trying to get at here, of course,
people who can't argue bore me. It is tedious trying to debate with people who don't know how to argue, who don't know how to rebut, who have no responsibility in even trying to examine the facts, who are not interested in opposing cases. It's just boring. That's what it is, because you get nowhere. Often I will get into a Twitter spat with somebody, and within about 5 exchanges, you know this person is not paying any attention to what I'm saying. They're just saying the same thing over and over again, whatever I say. So I generally tell them to get lost, and if they don't, I'll mute them.
God has come up once or twice in this conversation so far, so let's go there. What role has God played in your success, do you think?
I have no idea. I don't imagine God concerns himself very much with the material success of journalists in the Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland in the year of grace 2018.
But do you look to God for inspiration?
That's not the way that I view my religion, no.
How do you view your religion?
Oh, it's the centre of my thinking. It is the heart of my belief about the world, about how to treat other people, how to behave myself, and it's also the source of an enormous amount of poetic and artistic force which I hope instructs and guides what I say.
Your brother was a famous, I don't know whether the right word here is agnostic or atheist. Richard Dawkins would describe himself even as something like a 6.9 out of 7 or a 6.7 out of 7 because he can't exclude the possibility of God. But your brother certainly was not religious by the time that he died.
No.
Where did God come to you in your life? At what point? And was your upbringing anything to do with that?
Well, my upbringing gave me the Anglican formation, which I later returned to. It gave me a form in which religion could be approached, and actually rather an intelligent and an appealing form once you've understood what's going on.
His illness and his death from cancer, I don't believe, changed Christopher's understanding of God, or in a sense, rejection of God. Did it change your relationship with God?
Why would it have done?
Did God help you in that process?
I wouldn't have expected him to, particularly. Beyond that, let's say the reasons why I returned to faith are both immensely private and totally boring and cliched, and so I don't talk about them. You'll work them out for yourself.
Do you...
I mean, it's life. This is the experience of life that people have.
How do you imagine God?
One of the points about God is it's not imaginable. How would you imagine something greater than yourself? This is the problem. The human mind simply cannot, and shies away from and flees from the idea of a creator.
But you, Peter,
so much greater than you. If you made something, how could it conceivably imagine you in your absence if it had never met you? Reason will take you in this matter. Reason and facts will take you no further than agnosticism. The choice between, if you want to choose to be an atheist or you want to choose to be a theist, then it's a decision about what sort of cosmos you want to live in, whether you want to live in a cosmic car crash in which nothing has any significance and your actions have no significance beyond their immediate effect, or you want to live in a designed and purposeful universe whose purposes you might be able to discover and follow. Those are the differences. I strongly prefer the idea of an ordered, purposeful universe in which there is justice. And if I desire it for other people, then I have to desire it for myself. I mean, all we're doing is groping towards some sort of understanding of everything which is by definition incomprehensible to us in a way which one hopes will improve our own behaviour and understanding and make us better fitted for whatever follows after we're dead.
Peter, fantastic to spend this amount of time with you. I want just now to ask you some quick-fire questions. How hard do you work?
Not very by the standards of, for instance, my father.
Are you still getting better as a writer and journalist?
Well, I hope so, but again, other people have to judge.
How do you switch off from work?
I don't think I ever do.
Are you a perfectionist?
No.
Do you wish that you had been more successful than you have been thus far?
I wish that some of the books that I'd written had made more impact and that more people had read them.
Do you feel that you really have got there, that you have made it?
I'm not sure what making it involves. I very strongly believe in the maxim called no man happy until he's dead.
You got married in the early 1980s. You have 3 children. To what extent has your wife contributed to your career success?
Enormously.
In what way? Give me an example.
I don't really like discussing anything to do with my private life in public places, but she's been at my side in all kinds of circumstances, including 2.5 years with young children in Soviet Moscow, which I think gives you an example of the sort of support and comfort that I've had from her.
Having spent quite a bit of your time, I'm sure, around other successful people, when you look around you at your peers, do you have a positional sense or understanding of success? Do you feel in any way, I'm doing a bit better than him or her, or I'd like to be doing as well as he or she is? Well,
fortunately for me, I've probably reached a stage in my life where things like that don't worry me particularly. But most of the time that I've spent earning a living, my main worry has been, am I going to be able to continue to pay the mortgage and, in my case, to pay the school fees? That has been my measure of whether I've succeeded in what I was doing in simple material terms.
To what extent has luck played a role in your success? And can you imagine a parallel path in which Peter Hitchens would not have been a national journalist?
Oh, yes. I was very lucky, but at no stage when I was lucky did I realise. There's the old joke about Winston Churchill being told after he'd lost the 1945 election by Clementine that it was probably a blessing in disguise. And he said, well, it seems to me that the disguise is most effectual. There were occasions in my life when I really, my life was a educational car crash, particularly. But if I had not got into the scrapes and troubles that I got into, I might conceivably now just be retiring as a medium-level history don at the University of Leicester. I've got nothing against the University of Leicester. I'm just saying it wouldn't have been anything like as much fun as being a columnist for the Mail on Sunday.
Peter Hitchens, thank you very much indeed. I'll be back next week asking the comedian David Baddiel how he got there. Until then, goodbye.